Reports are emerging that a rift is widening amid growing tension between Prince Harry and King Charles.
The room was quiet when the order was signed. No raised voice, no public warning, no dramatic announcement from palace gates. Just a sheet of paper, a royal signature, and a decision that may have closed the last private door Prince Harry and Meghan still believed remained open to them. For years, Harry had lost titles, duties, military honors, official roles, and public standing inside the institution he was born into. Piece by piece, the structure around him had changed. But even after all of that, there was still believed to be one final thread connecting him to the royal household in a way that was more personal than procedural. Something quieter, something less visible, something that still suggested that whatever had broken in public, family access had not been entirely erased. And then Charles signed. What disappeared was not just a practical advantage. It was the emotional meaning behind it. Because to Harry, and increasingly to Meghan, this was never only about permission, protocol, or residence. It was about whether there was still any place left where family could exist before institution stepped in. And when they realized what that signature meant, the reaction was said to be far more personal than public. Before we get to the moment Harry and Meghan understood what had been taken, it matters to understand why this decision felt so much larger than a routine royal adjustment. Because this was not treated like another administrative update. Inside the emotional logic of the family, it carried the weight of a final message. And the message was simple. Whatever informal exception once existed had reached its end. By that point, Harry had already watched the old life fall away in stages. He had stepped back as a working royal. He had seen ceremonial links weakened. He had felt the distance grow not only between himself and the monarchy, but between himself and the people who once defined home. Publicly, those losses could be explained as consequence, transition, or constitutional necessity. Privately, they felt like layers being stripped away one after another. But this was different. This was not another front-facing duty removed from a man now living abroad. This was something closer to the internal mechanics of belonging. The kind of privilege that may not look dramatic from the outside, but feels enormous to the person who loses it. Because when an institution changes how you are allowed to approach it, what is really changing is not just access. It is the meaning of your place inside it. That is why the signature mattered. Charles is said to have understood exactly how it would be interpreted. On paper, the order may have looked disciplined, structured, even necessary. But emotionally, it was bound to land as something else entirely. Not just a limit, not just a rule, a signal, a boundary with family written underneath it. And Harry, perhaps more than anyone, was always going to read it that way. The cruel part of decisions like these is that they rarely arrive as explosions. They arrive as wording, quiet wording, official wording, phrases designed to sound neutral while carrying consequences that are anything but neutral. By the time the document was finalized, those consequences had already been debated at the highest levels of royal handling. The concern was not simply what Harry wanted. It was what the monarchy could still allow without blurring the line between private relationship and royal structure. That line, once crossed too many times, becomes the very thing a king feels forced to redraw. And that is where Meghan enters the center of this moment. Because while Harry felt the loss as a son, Meghan is believed to have seen it as something equally devastating, but from a different angle. Not the loss of ceremony, not the loss of status, the loss of any illusion that there was still an unguarded route back into the family. For her, this would not have looked like one more palace correction. It would have looked like confirmation that the emotional walls were now being reinforced in writing. By the time the message reached them, the damage had already been done. Harry reportedly did what many people do when reality arrives in formal language. He read it once, then again, slower the second time, as if the meaning might shift if the eyes stayed on the page long enough. But the words did not move. The door they described had changed. The terms had changed. The expectation of informal ease had changed. And Meghan, watching him absorb it, may have understood before he said anything that this one had cut deeper than the others. Because some losses humiliate you in public, others wound you in private. This one did both. What made the moment more painful was the timing. By then, there had already been enough public strain, enough interviews, enough accusations, enough carefully managed statements from all sides for many people to assume that nothing meaningful remained to be broken. But families do not break all at once. They break in stages. Then they break again in smaller, quieter ways. The last damage often comes after the world thinks the worst has already happened. And this may have been that kind of damage. There is also the question that sat behind the order itself. Why now? Why formalize this at this stage unless something had changed behind the scenes? Because these decisions do not usually appear from nowhere. They are often the result of build-up, friction, repeated disappointment, or one final encounter that convinces everyone involved the old arrangement can no longer hold. That is where the story becomes more complicated. Because according to the logic surrounding the decision, Charles did not wake up one morning and suddenly decide to erase the last informal privilege attached to his younger son. A move like this would more likely have followed a period of frustration in which every attempt to keep private lines open had become harder, more politically risky, and more emotionally volatile. In other words, this order may not have been the beginning of the rupture. It may have been the moment the palace admitted the rupture had already gone too far to manage quietly. And that is what makes the title so powerful. Not that something ended, but that something believed to be the last surviving piece of the old relationship was judged unsustainable. William's position in all of this adds another layer. Because whenever Charles makes a decision that touches Harry so directly, people immediately wonder whether William supported it, resisted it, or simply accepted that the relationship had reached a point where boundaries would now speak louder than affection. That question matters because William stands in a uniquely painful place. He is not just the future king. He is the brother who understands exactly what royal closeness once looked like and exactly how far it has fallen. If he knew what was coming, then he knew what it would mean. If he did not know the exact moment it would happen, then the signature may still have shocked him by its finality. Either way, he would have understood the symbolism instantly. Harry had lost many things before, but symbols matter more than people admit. A medal can be ceremonial, a title can be formal, a role can be constitutional, but a private route into the family carries emotional weight because it suggests something ordinary still survives inside an extraordinary institution. Once that disappears, the argument changes. It is no longer about what role you hold. It is about whether the institution has decided that ordinary family access itself must now be filtered. That is the kind of realization that hits slowly, then all at once. And that may explain why the reaction between Harry and Meghan has been described in such stark emotional terms. Not because a palace privilege is more important than love, marriage, or personal freedom, but because certain decisions force people to admit that what they thought was still salvageable may already be gone. Meghan, more than most, has lived inside that tension. She has stood beside Harry through the public exit, the pressure, the criticism, the reinvention, the attempts to build a new identity away from royal dependence. Yet this kind of order carries a different sting. It says that distance is no longer just emotional or geographical. It is now procedural, and procedures outlast moods. That is what made Charles's signature so heavy. He was not simply reacting as a father nursing disappointment. He was acting as sovereign, aware that any remaining exception could be interpreted as weakness, contradiction, or selective flexibility inside a monarchy that survives by rules looking consistent. The deeper the family pain became, the harder it may have seemed to justify a private arrangement that suggested Harry still occupied a uniquely favored channel. Yet that institutional reasoning does not soften the personal blow. In fact, it often makes it worse. Because from Harry's perspective, the pain would not lie only in losing convenience. It would lie in realizing that his father had chosen to formalize the distance rather than keep even a small space protected from it. That is the heartbreak inside stories like this. One person thinks they are creating clarity. The other experiences it as rejection. Both can believe they are right. Both can walk away wounded. And somewhere in the middle sits the unanswered question that has haunted this family for years. Can a father and son still find each other once every path between them has become symbolic? That question is what turns this from royal procedure into human drama. There are suggestions that before the order was signed, hope had not completely vanished. That private contact, or the possibility of it, was still treated by Harry as proof that the relationship with Charles had not been fully reduced to headlines and handlers. If that is true, then the order would not simply have removed a practical route. It would have removed the meaning Harry attached to it. And once meaning collapses, emotion follows quickly behind. That may be why those around the couple believe the reaction was so severe. The phrase break down is dramatic, but moments like this do not always look theatrical. Sometimes breaking down means silence. Sometimes it means staring at paper without speaking. Sometimes it means anger that burns for a minute and then falls into exhaustion. Sometimes it means one person trying to explain that a legal adjustment should not define a family bond, while the other can no longer separate the two. Harry has long struggled with that separation. For him, institution and family were never cleanly divided. The palace was not just a machine. It was the architecture of his childhood, his identity, his mother's story, his service, his grief, his purpose, and his conflict. To lose access within that world does not feel technical when that world shaped the emotional map of your life. It feels like the house is rearranging itself to remind you that you no longer enter the way you once did. And Meghan would have seen exactly what that did to him. Critics will say this is exactly what happens when people step away from royal duty and then expect royal treatment to remain. Supporters will say the monarchy keeps proving Harry's deepest fears right by choosing control over compassion. But neither side fully captures the private tragedy buried underneath both arguments. Because at the center of it is not just a prince and a king. It is a son wondering whether the last protected space between him and his father has now been closed by signature. That is why even a small sentence in an order can feel devastating, especially if it confirms something you were still trying not to believe. And for Meghan, the moment may have carried one more meaning. If the palace was willing to reduce the last remaining informal privilege attached to Harry, then whatever prospect once existed of a softer reconciliation through family channels had become much harder to imagine. In that sense, the order would not only define Harry's standing, it would define the emotional weather around the couple's future dealings with the royal family. Every visit would now mean more planning. Every contact would carry more weight. Every request would arrive with more awareness of what had already been lost. That changes behavior. It changes tone. It changes hope. And once hope changes, relationships change with it. The public, of course, would read all of this through their own preferred lens. Some would call it overdue. Others would call it vindictive. Some would insist nothing real had been taken at all. Others would argue that the most important things in royal life are often the least visible. But what tends to endure in stories like this is not the procedural language. It is the image. A king signing. A son reading. A couple realizing that the last soft edge of an already hard relationship may just have disappeared. That image writes itself into public memory because it is simple enough to understand and painful enough to repeat. And yet the most revealing part may come after the order, not before it. Because once something final appears to happen, people show who they really are in the response. Does Harry lash out? Does Meghan push back publicly? Does Charles regret the emotional interpretation even while defending the decision? Does William try to calm the temperature behind the scenes? These are the moments that determine whether a rupture stays permanent or begins, however faintly, to transform into something else. Sometimes the removal of a privilege ends the argument. Sometimes it exposes the real argument for the first time. If Harry's deepest pain was never about rank but about recognition, then losing the final privilege may force a brutal clarity. He cannot come back through special treatment. He cannot rely on old assumptions. He cannot mistake private accommodation for restored trust. Whatever remains with Charles from here, if anything remains, must now exist without the shelter of royal exception. That is a devastating realization, but it may also be the only honest one left. Because as long as some special door remained, the temptation would always exist to believe the old world was not fully gone. Charles's signature may have destroyed that illusion. And illusions, once broken, leave people with a choice. Keep fighting the ghost of what used to be, or face what the relationship actually is now. That is a cruel kind of gift, but it is still a kind of truth. For Charles, the decision may have been about preserving the logic of monarchy. For Harry, it may have felt like confirmation that even family now arrives through barriers. For Meghan, it may have looked like proof that no amount of distance, reinvention, or patience has changed how cold palace decisions can become once written down. For William, it likely underscored what he has known for years, that every unresolved wound in this family eventually returns wearing constitutional language. And that is perhaps the darkest part of the whole story. Royal life has a way of taking deeply personal pain and translating it into process. What should be spoken in tears gets written in protocol. What should be repaired in private ends up encoded in rules. A father's hesitation becomes an official review. A son's longing becomes an access question. A family fracture becomes household management. By the time the world sees it, the human mess has already been ironed into formality. But the emotions remain underneath. And that is why this moment has hit so hard. Because no matter how carefully the order may have been drafted, no matter how justified it may appear to those defending the crown, Harry and Meghan were never going to experience it as neutral. Not after everything that came before. Not after every prior loss. Not after years of trying, failing, leaving, speaking, defending, and surviving under public scrutiny. At some point, another official line on a page stops feeling like governance and starts feeling like a verdict. That may be exactly how it landed. Still, one possibility remains more haunting than all the others. What if Charles did not sign the order to end the relationship, but to force it out of the palace frame entirely? What if removing the final privilege was not meant to erase Harry as a son, but to make clear that sonhood could no longer travel through royal entitlement? That would not make the decision painless. It might even make it more painful, but it would change its meaning. Because then the order would say, not this way anymore. And that is very different from saying, not at all. Whether Harry can accept that distinction may determine everything that comes next. If he sees only rejection, then the wound deepens. If he sees boundary rather than banishment, then however fragile the possibility may be, some path still exists. A colder path, a slower path, a far less privileged path, but a path. And perhaps that is where Meghan's role becomes most important. Because in moments when emotion threatens to interpret everything as final abandonment, the person beside you often becomes the one trying to separate what has ended from what has not. Not to deny the pain, not to excuse the decision, but to stop the grief from telling a bigger story than the truth can support. The truth here may be brutal enough already. A royal privilege may be gone. A last private ease may be over. An old assumption may have died on the page where Charles placed his name. But families do not always end at the same moment their old structures do. Sometimes what dies first is the protected route. Then comes the harder question of whether anything living can survive without it. That is the question hanging over Harry and Meghan now. Not whether the privilege returns. Not whether the palace changes course. But whether a relationship stripped of status, special channels, and inherited convenience can still breathe as something real. Charles signed the order. That part is done. What remains unwritten is whether the final privilege was the last thing holding father and son together, or merely the last illusion that it was. And for Harry and Meghan, that may be the most painful realization of all, because losing the privilege hurts. But discovering that the privilege may have been all that was left between the family and the distance hurts far more.